3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in the halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the dark lord on his dark throne. In the land of Mordor where the shadows lie, 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all and in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. We're talking about fantasy stuff.
So I don't know about you, Trent, but I'm kind of
You
what
don't
would
know
say.
anything about me.
You're right, though, because you are a skinwalker and I know nothing about you.
I'm an enigma.
I'm what you would call a little.
Illiterate.
Yes, I can't read. No, I'm a big fan of fantasy novels. I one of the first book I ever read on my own and was read to me was The Hobbit, which inspired and probably an unhealthy obsession with fantasy.
I like fantasy stuff. It's a good distraction.
I feel
I'm
like
not a nerd like you. You know, I watch sports, check out the game, drink beer with the bros.
I don't think you've ever done that, like once in your entire life.
I'm all about working out, testosterone. I don't
So
have time for these hobbits and wizards and magic, you know, real world stuff, men stuff.
so I guess to just get us started, considering your preferences, I guess, what would you say is your favorite fantasy novel?
The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings. I am absolutely obsessed with anything that Tolkien has made. I own almost every book he's wrote, from The Hobbit to the original three in the trilogy to the Silmarillion to like the Guide to the Middle Earth. Uh, I think Tolkien is the beginning of all fantasy novels. He is the reason that we have this such in popular culture. If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have had the boom.
Yeah, I mean, he revolutionized what he defined. He set the rules and made what modern fantasy is today. Like everything that we you think of that you see in common media for like D&D, fantasy
But
movies, like he
if
is the biggest contributor to that.
and I know like a lot of people were like, "Well, it's just full of tropes." Yeah, it's full of tropes because he's the one who
Yeah,
started the tropes.
you can't
He,
judge it
the,
because that. I mean, and
he
I
was the first. Like, oh, the guy came back from the death more powerful or whatever. Yeah, that's where it started. Well, except the Bible, I guess.
yeah, but that's cheating. Um, Well, I mean, like that does bring up a little bit, and I don't want to go too much into it, but I mean, Lord of the Rings had kind of arguably had some Christian like overtones to it. Um,
Yeah, I think more of C.S. Lewis's stuff with Narnia had
and
Christian
I mean, and that's no
overtones.
doubt true. I'm just saying that like
Uh,
those
I think the
that
Lord of the Rings.
influence
If you're
was
gonna
there.
base the Lord of the Rings off of anything, it's honestly probably Tolkien's experience in the World
Yeah,
War.
absolutely. And I mean, his views on it, like I mean, the most common one that a lot
And
of people know about nowadays is that his
and
views
I
on
think a good
industrialism.
like introduction to the topic of fantasy is the idea that fantasy is meant as a way to as escapism.
Mm.
It's meant to make the world more beautiful and magical, and just sort of explain deep concepts with this idea of good versus evil. And you know, with Tolkien, it was really set out. You have this evil threat. There's no doubt. No, like no one's being like, Sauron. He misunderstood good, big fiery eye. He was gonna do good stuff. Like, but as that progressed, villains became more allegories of more complex societal things, such as evolving into the Game of Thrones, where you have all this political theater and future fantasy stuffs.
I a lot of people I see whenever they talk about fantasy novels, do they mention the term escapism, which you did bring up, which is not always entirely true. I mean, you can look at things like The Witcher or Game of Thrones, and they are not escapism. They are these grim, almost grim dark fantasies that I can assume most people wouldn't want to live in.
But I disagree because fantasy gives you the opportunity to, because you're not watching in the experience of these fantasy novels of, oh God, what if I was there? Because if my little 152 scrawny ass was in the Witcher or Game of Thrones world, I'm Orc Chow. It's just 100%. I'm ground up, put into a can, and they're going to sell me on the corner market for third breakfast. Uh, but people are allowed to put themselves in the places of the protagonists and heroes. You can picture yourself as Geralt. You can picture yourself as these protagonists, and it allows you to have an enhanced view of what you're not in the real world.
So, I'm going through like I normally, as y'all probably know if y'all have been watching this far, we usually do a little bit of research beforehand for each video, and I part of my
I don't.
research
I'm just
was
naturally good.
don't lie to them. So I was kind of putting together some interesting like writers and like book series that I particularly enjoy.
And I think now that we're going to be talking about specific books along the way instead of just the purpose of fantasy novels, this would be a good opportunity to introduce Nick.
And I had the perfect way to do that because the first book I wanted to talk about was The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. And I guess to kind of introduce
It's not chronological.
To kind of introduce that topic, we're going to bring in Nick.
Words are pale shadows of forgotten names. As names have power, words have power. Words can light fires in the minds of men. Words can wring tears from the hardest hearts. There are 7 words that will make a person love you. There are 10 words that will break a strong man's will. But a word is nothing but a painting of a fire. A name is the fire itself.
You just randomly quote poems from fantasy books. That's kind of lame. I don't know anyone who would do that.
I can't imagine.
If y'all can't guess, that is from the eloquent prose of Patrick Rothfuss.
Yes.
And I think Nick agrees with me here because we've talked about this before. He is kind of like, in my opinion, one of the modern masters of fantasy. And just prose in general. He is so eloquent with the way he words things.
The particular way in which he begins structure and develops a sentence is just... It's really just beautiful to watch and to read and to watch how he develops different storylines.
And if you can't tell, we highly recommend this book. And from what I remember... But I guess to kind of not to get too deep into that topic, I kind of had a question ready that I was interested in both of y'all. What would you all say were your kind of introductions to fantasy? I mean, obviously Lord of the Rings is going to be a big one, but like, what are some of the other ones that you think really kind of...
I'm a Tolkien boy full and through. Lord of the Rings was my introduction, but I mean, it's not medieval fantasy like we're describing with magic, but Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was the first book that I remember sitting down, and yes, it is science fantasy. I don't care what anyone says. The first book I just sat down and just remember laughing out loud reading a book, and at that point I didn't know that like reading could entertain you that in that way. I thought it was just like this epic adventure you playing in your head, not actually comedic satire that just had your stomach rolling. So those would be the 2 biggest influences for me.
What about you, Nick?
So, I've always been a fairly big fantasy guy. It takes a lot for me to get invested into a book series that I enjoy, and usually it's a fantasy novel. That being said, I think one of my actual first introductions into the world of fantasy was probably, and this is actually kind of funny because it's like the opposite of what people think when they think of fantasy, Magic Treehouse, which is technically children's historical fantasy, but the way that in each book it's like a small bow-wrapped adventure where they go back, they do something for someone at some point in history, and then they come back to their modern time. it's an easy delve into the ideas and the themes that often find in fantasy, but it's just nice, you know. It's a sweet little story about two kids, and it wraps up in like 80 pages.
That almost makes me want to posit that the Magic School Bus is also fantasy, which is absurd to me. And the fact
Well,
that you kind of make me agree with that in my own heart hurts me.
I think that Magic School Bus is a little different because they don't often go in time.
I don't think the Magic School Bus literally went into someone's butthole.
Yeah.
I feel like that's
that's pretty fantastical to me.
Well, alt science, I would say.
But if I had to pick for me, I mean, not kind of going that route. I'm gonna kind of go a different route. The first big fantasy series I ever read that like wasn't Lord of the Rings was probably The Legend of Drizzt by R.A. Salvatore. Which, if you haven't read and you just want to read like 30 fucking books worth of novel about a bunch of pretty interesting characters, it's also set in the world of D&D if that interests you. Highly recommend it. I wouldn't say he's the most talented. I wouldn't say he's the most talented writer ever. Comparatively, if we were making like a tier list of best writers, I don't know how high I would put him, but I mean the man has talent.
Yeah, for sure.
I've never read it, so I can't.
Another one that I don't know if anyone else here has read, but it was the Rangers Apprentice for me. I was a huge fan of the Rangers
I've read
books.
a few of those books. They're okay.
I haven't read them.
They're pretty good. I enjoyed them a lot as a child. But I guess we're going to kind of talk about like...
I would like to start an argument that
Alrighty.
I've never told either of you that I wanted to say for this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Name of the Wind is overrated.
I don't
It is
know
not as good. It is not what people hype it out to be the next step in modern day fantasy, and I have my arguments why.
Okay, first of all, have you read them? Both.
I've read all three.
Okay, then we know
I'm sorry.
you're lying.
That's an absolute lie. Only two of them have been published.
It comes down to the fact that how do you say it? Kavoth? Is that how you say his name? Kavoth. Especially in the second book, is too beloved by the author to actually go through any change and have any struggle. I do not particularly like fantasy novels where the author absolutely adores their character, and you can this book. I will admit he is fantastic with how he words things, but Kavoth honestly is a little bit of a know-it-all genius who kind of knows everything, and it doesn't feel like there's ever a situation he can't get out of. Specifically in the second book.
I feel like I can make some arguments against that, though. I do think at times he does come off that way. But he does fail. He is an idiot a lot of the time. He's just talented. He has a lot of natural talent. Mm-hmm. And he does put in a lot of work into what he does. Mm-hmm. Though there are times that
you don't see the story progression from him, because and when I was reading the book, you find out he's skilled and stuff, and then you find out he's such this young age, and I just don't feel like it's earned. And that's a lot of the issues I have with another fantasy novels, the Harry Potter series. I don't feel like in the books it really showed Harry earning the title as one of the most powerful wizards.
Okay, let's stick to the Name of the Wind first, or specifically, I guess.
And I started this at the beginning because I didn't want to put this at the end of an argument.
That's fair.
To have an argument.
I would start out here with the Wise Man's Fear by saying, first of all, we see, before we ever go into the origin story, I guess you could say, of Kavoth, in the tavern in Noir, as Coat, we see basically what's coming, where the story's gonna end. So he basically he's lost his talent for music, or at least stopped playing music. he's lost his talent for the magic system that I'm currently failing to remember, and he doesn't have his ability that he learns in the second book to fight like the with like the Lithani and stuff. So the fact that you don't see any progression from him in the second book, I don't think you can claim that when we see the end product.
It's not the ending problem. The ending is fine and all because, like, obviously he's old, retired, whatever.
He's only in his 20s, I think.
But it's the fact that you didn't see, because he's a mythical figure. Like, he is shrouded, like he's almighty. Like people hold him in like myth in this world. Would you agree to that?
I would agree that that's the narrative he himself created.
Well, yeah, but either whether he made the narrative or not, it's still.
Well, that's the point, though. The point of the narrative he pushed himself was that he wanted people to fear him.
Anyway, I don't think it's deserved because he comes off as just all powerful from the beginning. And it honestly threw me out of the series because I loved the first one. I thought the first one was going places. The second one really let me down, and the third one kind of brought it up a little bit.
What third one?
What third one do you
not
specifically cite?
Not the third one, sorry.
Yeah, because that one's not out yet.
Yeah, it's the second one let me down.
So let me kind of put it like this and posit it like this. One, I do disagree that it's not earned. I mean, he was very smart from the beginning, but that was just like, I think, like, you start out and he's in his, like, with his troop and he's being taught by Abernathy, it shows that at a young age he was being taught and had the capability to being taught, and that he had natural talent.
So this is the last negative thing I'm going to say about it. If you want my opinion, if you're going to read fantasy, if you're going to read this series, and I know y'all love this series, read the first one for the prose. It's eloquently written. The second one drops off, to be honest. It still has good prose. But I do not see the third book going in any plot development where this becomes just a groundbreaking series. I think this was just a one-and-done book series. And that's the argument. I've kept this for this podcast to have this discussion because I disagree with y'all fundamentally. This is the next big thing in fantasy.
I don't think it's the next big thing in fantasy, to be completely honest. I think
you said at the beginning of the podcast you thought it was like the best example of modern fantasy.
Yeah, but I don't think he's like. I don't think inherently. I think Rothfuss is one of, like, whenever I think of good modern fantasy, I think of Rothfuss. I think of like Brandon Sanderson.
Brandon Sanderson is leaps and bounds better than Rothfuss.
And I don't think Rothfuss is perfect. And I think you kind of have a little bit of a hate boner for him.
No, I don't. I think he writes beautifully. The problem is I don't like how he lays out his plot.
I think that's the big thing that we can kind of talk about. And I don't want to get too deep into it because I do want to talk about other topics. But I think that Rothfuss, I mean, one, it's a very interesting way to tell a book because you have kind of an unreliable narrator because it is a person's life story being told by that person. That is what we are reading for the majority of it. And one thing that I've always found fascinating whenever I was reading the book is that whenever you read the portions that are set outside of that, they're very dull and kind of like have this melancholy feel to them, where the story that is being told, I mean, like it is written so much more eloquently, is because it is being told by a talented storyteller that is embellishing a lot of these things. And it's not going to be 100% accurate. And I do find it kind of interesting that, like, there are a lot of arguments to make that Kvothe is like a Mary Sue kind of character. And while I don't agree with all of them,
that's exactly that. You hit my point right there. That's the word I could not think of. I've been trying to think of what you call a character that's.
But
I don't like Mary Sue main characters.
But I don't think he's inherently a Mary Sue character. I think that's kind of people kind of reading very surface level a lot of things about him. But I don't want to, like, I don't think it's a perfect book by any amount. I don't think it's like this perfect fantasy series. I mean, I don't, and like, it's inherently you're going to compare any fantasy series to, um, like J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings, because that's just kind of how it's going to happen.
I can think of a few modern fantasy books that, in my mind, don't rival it, but or at least the successors. Brandon Sanderson, I think that his Way of the King series, no, the Stormlight archive, the Way of the King's book is fantastically written. It's not as good prose as as Rothfuss, but the world building and the characters are more depth and more relatable. I
But
don't like characters that I don't feel like they're ever in trouble of not dying.
I guess the point I wanted to make is that like I see a lot of negative talk about Rothfuss and his writing and his books, um, and I don't want that to discourage people from going into these books
No,
and making and
uh,
formulating your own opinions, because he is very talented. I do disagree with the way he writes a lot. There are some portions of his books that I like less than the others, and even some portions I just don't like at all. But I
if
do not think that discredits the fact that they are good books.
Okay, we can leave that there. I think that's a good discussion on the Name of the Wind.
But
Uh,
to kind of go into Brandon Sanderson, I did want to give a shout out to. So if you didn't know this, we're all nerds, and Trent can lie all you want. He is one as well. We play D&D. We
I
play
like manly things.
we play Magic the Gathering. We play D&D. Uh, and speaking of Brandon Sanderson, if anyone who is listening has any fascination with him as a writer, or like Magic the Gathering or anything like that, he wrote a book called Children of the Nameless. Really great short story. Highly recommend it. On YouTube, there is a fully it's orchestrated. It has a full casted voice acting crew. It is by the voice of Minnie, if I remember right. Highly recommend it. But I guess,
I do. I want to bring up a topic.
yeah,
Uh, we've mentioned the fantasy writers, and I do think there is, in my opinion, the number one fantasy writer of our age. I do think there is someone that can definitively hold that status,
I don't know.
and
You'll have to convince me.
Neil Gaiman.
Okay, that is a pretty solid argument. I'm a big fan of Neil Gaiman.
I think his creativity, his range of what he can write about, uh, his comedic time. I like a book that isn't just all serious. It has comedy, seriousness, well developed characters. They're not Mary Sue, and it's just. And I also like that he ties in real world aspects, the ideas of angels, demons, these old gods. Uh, his ability to create brand new worlds with Coraline. I just think he is a fantastic fantasy writer, and he is the fantasy writer of our modern age.
I think I have to agree with that. I mean, Neil Gaiman, I don't, and we can kind of get Nick's input in this in a second too. But I mean, like we're talking like Sandman, Good Omens. Like he has range and he has talent. Like he,
And I know people would say like, well, Martin is the successor of Tolkien. I disagree on that fact just because I feel like Tolkien, he's not the successor of Tolkien. He's more of like the continuation. He's just bringing Tolkien into the modern age with more serious topics.
I
But
don't even know that.
Gaiman, on the other hand, is doing what, in my mind, Tolkien has did in his day, changing the game of fantasy, the fantasy genre itself. And that's what you need in order to be the continuation of Tolkien.
I think this is kind of talking about Martin. I have very mixed opinions about Martin. I'm not. I'm gonna say it outright. I'm not the biggest fan of Game of Thrones. I enjoy a lot of it. And
Is
not.
this because of the show or the books? Have you read the books?
I'm reading the books. I'm about halfway through the books, and I finished the show. Um,
I will state that I think the
um,
books do the show do it better.
I think that I don't think he is Tolkien's equal, but I don't think anyone really can.
Well, No, because Tolkien came at a time where fantasy wasn't a major genre.
Yeah, I mean,
He just changed the game, and that's why I said I think Neil Gaiman is the closest thing to
yeah.
his successor, because he's the closest thing to doing what Tolkien did by bringing fantasy into the modern age.
What do you think?
I think that at one point, dadgummit, who wrote the Harry Potter series? Rowling. Rowling had the chance of maybe taking that position, but she kind of ruined it by going back and backtracking on all her work.
What is your opinion on this, Nick?
So I'll be honest. I've not read half of the artists that you've mentioned. I'm only familiar with Gaiman's Coraline, and that's because of the movie. So while I'm not necessarily qualified to speak on whether or not Neil Gaiman is modern fantasy legend or if R. Martin is, because honestly his book has been on my to read list for a long time, I will comment on J.K. Rowling because I've read her entire Harry Potter series.
Harry Potter is fantasy. I know people put that into teen fiction, but it's fantasy.
And it's made the list, several lists for top fantasy of all time.
And honestly, it's more similar to Tolkien's Lord of the Rings than anything because it was aimed toward children. People forget that the Lord of the Rings was a children's book.
Well,
The Hobbit was.
You kind of corrected yourself in the end.
The Hobbit was a children's book. Yeah.
For those who don't know, The Hobbit was written for Tolkien's children, and then the publisher saw it, and they were like, "Hey, we're going to publish this." And then they asked him, like, "Hey, can we get some more from this?" And instead of writing another children's book in this setting, he instead decided to.
For some reason, they cut out like a bunch about like Hobbit milk. It was real weird.
Hobbit milk.
Apparently, hobbits had like titties, and
it was a really big thing.
Suckle at my hobbit teat.
It was very important.
Highly recommend.
What I was going to say.
Look up Hobbit milk on YouTube. It's really funny.
What I was going to say about Joe Rowling, though, is that
Joe Rowling.
Yeah, J.K. Rowling.
Her name's Joe.
Joanne.
Are you on first name basis? I don't know if you could really claim to be on first name basis with J.K. Rowling.
I mean,
like I'm on first name basis with Beyonce, but like
everyone is though.
Okay, so the thing about Rowling and her writing is that if the beginning, like the first book and the first, I would go like the first 3 or 4 books are just really, really good. The problem is where about the 4th book published is when I think that's about when the movie starts or the movies begin. And I think that she gets a little too big for her britches and she puts extra stuff in and she embellishes and she gets lost in her own writing. And if you look back between the books, like the first half of the series versus the second half, there's a lot of inconsistencies. And there's a lot of just things that you would think that she would have fact checked that she didn't actually fact check.
Well, I mean that comes down to she didn't have the story finished. I mean the original Harry Potter book was supposed to be a one-off thing. The Philosopher's Stone, it was just supposed to be a book. She published it, but it ended up being super popular, and she wrote the second and made the story. She just didn't have a concrete story from the very beginning. And that's going to lead to inconsistencies.
I think that she did a really good job of establishing an interesting magic system.
See, I disagree. I don't think the magic... I love Harry Potter, and I think the magic is awesome, but I don't think it's an interesting system. There's not really anything behind it.
What I mean by interesting system is that it's of modern magic systems that I'm familiar with, and I will state that I'm familiar with few. It's the one that you can look at as a kid and be like, okay, this is like the easiest for me to understand, and I want that.
Well, magic and fantasy is divided into 2 categories. There's hard magic systems and soft magic systems. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Well, to the viewers, hard magic systems are magic systems that have concrete rules. Name of the Wind has a hard magic system. There's rules. You can't break it. The Witcher has a hard magic system. Lord of the Rings has a soft magic system. You don't really know what's going on. It's this mysterious thing. Harry Potter's another soft magic system.
What's the most impressive about Harry Potter though is just how relatable it is. And that's where we get into
I think that the relatability comes into the side characters. I think Harry once again is kind of another Mary Sue.
Well, see, I don't think that he's necessarily a Mary Sue because of the fact that he never actually gets that Mary Sue attitude. Like he's always aware that he is not the one who is actually doing things. He's always like relying on Dumbledore or I didn't really do all of these things. Like he does a good job of giving credit to those around him.
The Mary Sue aspect is more prominent in the movies.
I think
that's true.
I think that like really because a Mary Sue is someone without like they really lack flaws, and I think it's kind of he has.
And a Mary Sue is more of like a typical protagonist where like everything just kind of works out for him.
I wouldn't say that your parents dead and most of the people around you dying as you progress through 7 books.
Also being beaten,
things going out for you,
hunted down,
hated by your own family,
hated by everyone else.
Like I said, more prominent in the movies than the book. Because in the book, he actually has personality. Harry's a sassy little bitch in the books.
But even still, I think that it's just so relatable to me, which is why I hold the book series in a high regard because of the fact that it's just very relatable.
Man, maybe if you stopped reading Harry Potter as much, you could relate to some bitches.
God damn.
That doesn't make any sense.
I did kind of want to ask this, and this kind of applies to a lot of fantasy novels in general, I guess. Do you think that your love for Harry Potter is heavily biased because of the age you read it at? Because I've never read it. I only just recently started the first Harry Potter.
If you did not read Harry Potter from the age of like 8 to 14, you will not enjoy it as much.
Probably. I would probably agree with that because it's just... I mean, with that being said, I did read it backwards.
For one reason, when you're reading it at an older age, you're just a little bit aware of why aren't these teenagers humping more.
So, regardless of that statement,
they're in co-ed dorms with magic wands that are very phallically shaped. You know they're humping.
Well, to be fair, we do see that in the book, as a boy tries to go up to the girls' dormitory, it turns into a slide that shoots him back down.
Got magic. They're humping.
That being said,
they use them wands for a little bit more other things.
I read Harry Potter. The first time I read the Harry Potter book series, I read it backwards. I read it 7-1. I read it 7-1. So I don't.
At what point did you realize you had messed up, or did you just think this was a really just like interestingly paced book?
Obviously, I knew that 7-1 was not the correct way to read it because they have numbers on them. But 7 was the first book that I bought, and here's why I read it like this.
Why was Dumbledore dead in the first one, but not this one? This is exactly. Weird.
I read it like this because at the book fair they only had the 7th book left, and I was determined to buy a Harry Potter book, so I bought the 7th book and read it first, and then I just was like, okay, I've read this one, I might as well read them backwards. So I checked out the 6th book from the library.
So as a person who's trying to get into Harry Potter, would you recommend reading it that way?
No, I would not.
It was horrible. I don't know why I kept doing it.
It reminds me of
that
one post where the guy or girl, I don't know the gender of the person, was like, I accidentally read a page in the back of the book of the last Harry Potter series, and all I got was Ginny kissed Dumbledore. And I closed the book, and all I could think of was, what a damn plot twist.
Yeah, that would be quite the plot twist.
So I would also like to imagine, like in my brain, I also like to imagine that you read the books themselves backwards.
Yeah, I read them backwards, and it's really confusing when you try and do that.
I can't even read forward.
So I guess to move on a little bit, and I think I want to talk about is like...
Dragons!
Dragons.
Yeah, we have been this entire episode and we've not talked about like the number one thing in fantasy novels, and it is dragons.
I don't know if that's the number one thing though.
No, dragons are the number one thing in fantasy. Well, maybe number two. Magic maybe number one.
I would go with magic. Yeah.
I can't.
But
think
dragons, we cannot just talk about dragons. For one, dragons are cool.
Yeah.
Wyverns are different than dragons. Y'all can eat my butthole.
We're not going to get into a discussion of the different species of winged lizards.
You've already stated though that your favorite series is Tolkien's Ring series, and yet the dragon of that world, or at least of the continent that this takes place on, is in the origin story of the Hobbit.
Yeah.
It's also the main villain in the Hobbit.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's one book versus the series of three that are his more famous work.
Out of the majority of Lord of the Rings material, like Silmarillion, Children of Hurin, there are less dragons than there are more. You know.
Yeah, but there's still dragons.
That being one, we know of one.
Well, we know.
First of all, there are more
than
than one. Do I need to name the dragons in Lord of the Rings?
No, because I also know there is more than one. They're just not shown very.
We
often.
we only meet one.
That's also not.
Well, if you read the supporting material, you would know.
I have read the supporting material.
You've read the Silmarillion.
Well, that's the one I haven't read. But what I'm talking about the main series, the Ring trilogy.
That's not the supporting material.
Well, no, but I'm talking about the Ring trilogy, the main books.
You've read it.
There's only the mention of one dragon in the main
so you've
books,
read
and
the
we don't
Children
even
of
meet him.
Hurin.
I just told you I'm talking about the main Ring trilogy.
Well, then that's not the supporting material.
Okay, but we're talking about
you
the
can
series.
Support on my dick is what you can do.
So to get away from Trent's antagonistic personality, can we just all agree that the best film series of all time is the Lord of the Rings trilogy by Peter Jackson? Can we just all agree on that?
I can agree.
It's a good series.
But wait, back to dragons. What's your favorite fantasy novel that includes dragons? And the answer's not Aragon, because that's a shitty book series.
You're just going to attack Pesci like that. All right.
The people in this don't know who Pesci is.
Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire.
That's even less dragon than...
I mean,
there's
like,
four dragons in that movie.
I mean, it's
in
hard
that
to
book.
not, like, pick The Hobbit.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm being honest, it's probably The Hobbit, but also I could go
like,
Cheatsies with Name of the Wind and the Common Dracus.
That's Cheatsies, though. That's not a dragon.
That's true.
I mean, Lord, I'm not going to lie, Game of Thrones has pretty cool dragons.
I've never read Game of Thrones. It's on my to read list on
Why are
Audible.
you in a fantasy novel video? I feel like you were qualified to be an idiot talking about this.
I mean,
no. If anything, I am a qualified idiot.
Qualified. Because we are completely unqualified to talk about these things.
I didn't read your resume enough.
Y'all spent an hour last episode talking about Elon Musk. I don't think that we have to worry about this very much.
First of all, the topic was Elon Musk.
And y'all spent an hour talking about it.
Yeah, we did.
If anyone's not qualified to talk about a human they've never met, it would be you two.
You don't know I've never met him.
You've never met him.
You don't know that.
Do you think...
I do know that.
Elon Musk is a fantasy creature?
Elon Musk?
Yeah.
Wait, we established...
No, I think he's just European.
We established... First of all, he's African, idiot.
I thought he was Dutch.
No, he's from South Africa.
Okay, well, then he's African. Congratulations.
Sorry, I didn't mean to call you an idiot. I'm going to come hug you.
I don't need that.
Can I hug you?
No.
Can I rest in your bosom?
I would prefer that not happen.
Okay.
But I guess the kind of, like, another thing is that, like, if you... This isn't a closing statement, but this is kind of something... I wanted to do something interesting, that as we go throughout this, discussing fantasy novels and things like that, we kind of each, at different portions, give a recommendation for somebody to read. I've already given one, in that of The Children of the Nameless by Brandon Sanderson. What would be like a recommendation from both of y'all, starting with Nick?
So I mean, this isn't a shocker. I'm going to take the recommendation of The Name of the Wind, simply because, and despite Trent's slander against the books, I personally, and this is my own personal opinion, I enjoy both of his books. I think that The Name of the Wind is a masterclass of prose. He does an excellent job of world building. He does an excellent job of just jumping into a series, but also explaining it in a way that doesn't feel like you're having your hand held into the world, but you're just enjoying what is being presented to you. And it's such a delicate balance between that he does so well, that I enjoy so much. So my recommendation is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss.
What about you, Trent?
For the more casual reader, if you want a good laugh, I do recommend Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's just hilarious, just fun read. I think it's fantastic. As much as I love Lord of the Rings, I'm going to be honest with you, it's not an easy read unless you want the backstory of every twig.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd have to say Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy for a more casual viewer. If not, read anything by Neil Gaiman. Good Omens, fantastic book.
If I'm not mistaken, Good Omens is written by two of the more prized fantasy authors, because I think it's Terry Pratchett. He also helped write Good Omens.
Also a big fan of Terry Pratchett.
Yeah, he's a very funny dude.
Okay, now to kind of like, we're talking about fantasy novels in general. What would you say? And we can't say Kavoth. What would you say is one of the more iconic fantasy characters to you?
The most iconic fantasy character? Are we talking about in books?
Yes.
Is it wrong to say Gandalf?
If I had to pick someone from those books that I think is more iconic to me, and has a more interesting story, it has to be Aragorn. He is.
I think iconicness, though, honestly, Smeagol and Golem is so entwined in popular culture.
It's true.
And Harry Potter, Harry is probably the most well known.
I think Harry, especially, I think even more so in the movies, this is kind of a big thing.
Harry Potter is better at producing them, because you could look at a couple from the Harry Potter series. But also, that could just be because it's so modern.
I honestly, I'd have to go with Gollum or Harry. It's just, they're the most well known. They're the people that people would think of. Aragorn, in my opinion, has the best story.
I think he is one of the greatest stories in any fantasy novel of all time, to be completely honest.
He honestly does. Yeah, it's fantastic. But I just don't know.
Hero.
I don't know if he's well enough known in the popular public.
I can think of another one, and this is going to be probably one of my second recommendations, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it to get mine out a little bit early. Inigo Montoya from The Princess Bride.
Yeah.
A lot of people do not know.
Is that a book?
Yes, a lot of people do not know that The Princess Bride is a book, and that it is also a amazing book. And I do think, and these two know, because I go on about it a lot, that The Princess Bride is my favorite movie of all time. Mm-hmm. I have watched it probably more than any other person on this planet. The Princess Bride, I do think, is probably better than the movie. Like the book, it has, and Inigo Montoya from the book has one of the greatest characters I've ever seen. Just, if I had a recommendation, read The Princess Bride, get to the point about where it talks about Inigo Montoya and his father, and after you're done crying, you can thank me.
I can't believe we forgot Gandalf.
We did not.
I just said Gandalf.
Oh, I didn't hear you.
Yeah, I said Gandalf a while ago.
I'd agree on Inigo Montoya. Would y'all consider like Frankenstein fantasy?
Yeah, Absolutely.
Because honestly, that's probably the beginning of science fiction.
And I think that people
Yeah.
do not give enough credit to Mary Shelley. That she kind of helped revolutionize fantasy as well. Like everybody talks about Tolkien, but nobody talks about that Frankenstein set up things like in like Dracula and stuff like that. Set up these concepts of gothic horror and stuff like that, and other like using these fantastical concepts, which you just didn't see that often, to tell a story. And with like in like having these really kind of deep themes like hidden by them, like nobody really talks about it enough about how much he contributed to that.
Well,
I
will also
agree. I
state
think
that-
that, and the fact that she did this on a bet too.
Yeah.
I'll also state that it's not considered fantasy. But I mean, that being said, I'm sure that it absolutely laid the foundation for fantasy to make way.
Yeah.
But it's specifically considered a gothic novel.
I think it was because like we're talking about when like fantasy wasn't a genre at that point. I mean, this is before Tolkien set in stone what we, because Tolkien kind of defined what fantasy was. So of course we're not going to see a lot of things, but I do not think that discredits that she explored these more fantastical elements that you just didn't see in writing around that time, which was more grounded in reality.
So let me point this out: the fact that we say Tolkien started fantasy, but I don't know if he started fantasy. I think
I think he
brought it into popular culture, but I
Yeah.
think we're forgetting like a big historical tales like the Gilgamesh.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's
the
not,
Legends of Arthur, the King Arthur, the Sword and the Stone. Like
Well,
those are like the original.
Well, that's the thing that we're talking about, is that like those things are fantasy. Those stories are fantasy. But I think the argument, like he's not the original, but he's the one that defined the modern idea of fantasy. And there is no, I genuinely can't see a way of arguing around that he, while those things, like those need to be credited, and if you know a lot about Tolkien, he does credit them, the stories of Gilgamesh and stuff like that, as being inspirations for him. But Tolkien, I think you cannot argue that Tolkien defined what is modern fantasy.
Oh yeah, and I think we're getting to the point now where we're near the end. So I do have one last question to end this topic. If y'all could live in any fantasy book world, what would it be?
Middle Earth, Shire, easy.
It would be a pretty nice place to live.
Yeah, I can't.
Would be a nice
I
place.
can't think of like like people might say Harry Potter, but like you're just a wizard and you just still have modern problems. Like we have all this magic, but we still have like crappy modern problems. No, thank you. I would like to live in the Shire where only thing you worry about. People don't they don't worry about hunger. They don't worry about like not having a roof over their head. You just worry about
Something
fresh
about
green earth and.
Something about big bearded men possibly showing up on my door and taking me to slay a dragon, though, is not as tantalizing.
I mean, that's just a benefit to me.
He does have a large staff and a lot of weed.
I think they really undersell it in the movies. The amount of weed that
That
man is. I want y'all to know that the Lord of the Rings actually never happened. It was all Gandalf's weird fever acid dream.
Okay, so it is called pipeweed. It is. So it's meant to be an analog for tobacco, but it is stated that it does have slightly sedative properties.
I can't believe you didn't mention Dune in this conversation.
Okay, so before we end this off, we do have to mention Dune. Because Dune is sci-fi, is science fantasy. And I think that we can, to kind of list off, like, to give you an idea of
well,
like,
I mentioned Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, so...
But I mean, like, to give you, like, our audience kind of a broader idea of what science fantasy is, look at something like Star Wars. Star Wars is science fantasy.
There's... honestly so many subjects we didn't talk about. Like Alice in Wonderland, that's another one
Yeah.
that heavily introduced fantasy,
And
especially to children. I like how most fantasy, by the way, the popular old ones started off as children's books.
except Dune didn't.
No,
But-
Dune didn't.
Dune's also science fiction. It's not considered fantasy.
I do have to
I don't
make
know the
arguments.
difference.
It is classic. Like, I mean, so a lot of people look at Star Wars and also look at it as science fiction. I have to argue. I mean, Dune is more science fiction than science fantasy, but I do think that there are elements in it that kind of defined a lot of what modern science fantasy is, even though that wasn't its intention. But that's a topic for another day, talking about science fiction. Because I could go on, and also I think this would be a great episode to have a follow-up episode on, because I think there's a lot more we could talk about. But I feel like if we kept going right now, we would be going on.
I want to
for-
live in Harry Potter.
That's fair.
I'd literally just shoot Voldemort with an AK-47, call it a day, and do my magic.
I think I would live in Faerun, which is the setting of Legend of Drizzt.
Oh,
and
if we're doing that,
D&D
then
series.
I'm living in my own fantasy setting.
Well, no, but Faerun is an
Your
actual
fantasy
established
setting
setting.
scares me.
Yeah, that scares me too. But Faerun is a popular universe that is owned by wizards. That being said, it's D&D, and I love D&D, so that whole world and that system is something that I'm rather interested in.
And I guess to kind of finish as this final question, I did mention recommendations. Any final recommendations for anyone?
Nope. I think it's time to spin the wheel.
Alrighty, I do have one final recommendation. It would have to be the Dragonlance series. This was introduced to me by my mother, actually. Has probably one of the greatest fantasy characters of all time that I knew neither of these two would know about, in the form of Raistlin. If you read probably nothing else, I'd say read Dragonlance. But we can now spin the wheel.
Really quick, before you guys spin
oh.
the wheel, I just wanted to say thank you for having me on and giving me the opportunity to talk about some books, because reading has always been a really... Honestly, you go to escapism, but reading has always been something that I've just allowed me to have pleasure growing up. Reading was something that I did a lot because it was often more pleasurable than what could be going around. And not to say that I had a terrible childhood or anything, because my mom has been amazing, but reading has always given me just a just happiness. And so I wanted to say thank you for giving me the chance to come and talk about some books.
Yeah, absolutely. Spin that wheel, Trent.
Spinning wheel! Wheel go round. We will be talking about horror movies the next time.
Whoop, whoop! One of my favorite topics.
Oh, I'm glad I'm not here for that.
We'll be talking about slashing and dashing and guts and gore. So come back, kids, and because it won't be a bore. Wiki whack.
Alrighty. Everybody, see you later.